Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Chapter 7.
The trade with India, which had been almost the only one, and always an occasion for envy and contest, was sought for by the Spaniards and the Portuguese, who, as we have seen, were the first amongst modern nations that seemed to aspire at naval discovery. The manner in which Spain discovered America, and Portugal, the passage by the Cape of Good Hope, both nearly at the same period and at the beginning of the 16th century, is too well known to require the smallest detail. Europeans, with the superior degree of knowledge they possessed, and particularly that of the use of firearms, incited also by the love of gold, and careless of keeping their word with the unsuspecting natives, soon triumphed wherever they went, and the consequence was that both nations brought home immense riches. The trade of Venice, Alexandria, and Aleppo was all transferred to Lisbon, and never was so small a country so suddenly enriched, and it may be added, more quickly deprived afterwards of the chief source of its wealth. The Dutch had triumphed over the power of Spain on their own soil, and they soon rivaled that of Portugal in the east. It was a very different thing to combat the natives and to fight with the Dutch, who very soon deprived Portugal of the rich means of wealth she had discovered in India. The prosperity of Portugal, arising from its possession in the east, continued at its height exactly a century. Its decline is accounted for by the following causes: its domineering principles, too great an extent of conquests, which were widely scattered, and the haughtiness of the Portuguese, both towards the natives and Europeans, the envy and rivalship which brought the Dutch into the same countries, a great want of attention and energy, and lastly, giving a preference to the trade to the Brazils. The Brazils had been first discovered by the Portuguese, afterwards seized upon by the Dutch, whom they, however, expelled about the middle of the 16th century, that is, about 50 years after its first discovery, and an equal period of time previous to the decline of their trade in India. The possession of the whole of this lucrative trade that had enriched so many great nations, and that by so easy a channel, and without almost any contest, for nearly a whole century, had so enriched the small kingdom of Portugal that after being too eager and grasping at too much, it was almost ready to resign the whole without a struggle, had it not been for some reasons of another sort. So immense was the influx of wealth from the united sources of India and the Brazils, that the former, which has been at every other period the object of ambition of all nations, and is so still, was considered as scarcely worth retaining. It is almost unnecessary to add that from that moment Portugal has been on the decline. If ever the cup of prosperity ran over in large streams, it was then, and when the possession of the trade to India was scarcely thought worth preserving, it is clear that no great efforts could be made to encourage internal industry. Spain, extensive and powerful before it discovered the Indies, did not so immediately feel the effects of the wealth imported, as the Portuguese had done, but its prosperity was of less duration, though the decline was not quite so rapid. The Dutch must have known the effects of wealth on a nation, else they would scarcely have tried to throw off the yoke of Spain at the very moment when it appeared in its greatest splendor and power. Insolence and pride, we have too often had occasion to remark, accompany wealth, and Philip was no more proof against its effects than those potentates who had gone before him. There was a great resemblance between the project of invading England with the Invincible Armada, as it was called, and the attack on Greece by the King of Persia. That monarch must have thought very meanly of England, to suppose that the island could be conquered by 30,000 men, even if they could have made good their landing. Indeed, to try such an experiment on a nation that had supported its claim to valor so well at Agincourt and Cressy, and which was not in any respect degenerated, manifests his being blinded by the effects of wealth and greatness. The consequence was a gradual decline of the affairs of his kingdom, so that, in little less than a century, England placed a king on the throne of Spain. Though the effect produced on Spain was not so rapid as on Portugal, it was, in some respects, more irretrievable. The vast numbers of persons who quitted that country in quest of gold injured its population, already reduced by the expulsion of the Moors, who were the most industrious of its inhabitants. The wealth that came to Spain came in a very unequal distribution, which is a considerable disadvantage, and hastens on that state of things which is the natural forerunner of the decay of a nation. Wealth arising by commerce, however great its quantity, must be distributed with some degree of equality, but the great adventurers in the gold mines only shared with their sovereign, and the whole of their wealth came in prodigious quantities, pouring in upon the country. Both Spain and Portugal, finding that wealth came with such ease from India and America, neglected industry. This, indeed, was a very natural consequence, and when the sources of their riches began to dry up, they found, though too late, that instead of having increased in wealth, they had only been enriching more industrious nations and ruining themselves. The gold that arrives from the West passes through the hands of its masters with almost the same rapidity as if they were only agents for the English and the Dutch. So chimerical an idea is that of wealth existing without industry. The Dutch were the only rivals of the Portuguese in the East Indies, for though other nations came afterwards in for a share, yet the transition from wealth to weakness was already made by the Portuguese, before any of them had begun to set seriously to work in acquiring possessions or in carrying on trade with that country. Portugal thus fell merely from the rivalship of a more industrious and less advanced nation, after having embraced more territory than she had power to keep. Spain fell because she had embraced a wrong object as a source of riches. The Hanse towns, which owed their prosperity partly to their own wisdom and perseverance in the beginning, and partly to the contempt with which sovereigns, in the days of chivalry, viewed commerce, might, with very little penetration and much less exertion of wisdom than they had displayed, have seen that the spirit of commerce was becoming general, and that moderation and prudence were necessary to preserve them in their proud situation. But the prudence which they possessed at first had given way to pride and abandoned them, and the first great stroke they received was from Queen Elizabeth. The ruin of so widely extended a confederacy could not be astonishing, and indeed was a natural consequence of the changes in the manners of the times. But it was not so with Flanders. There was nothing to have prevented the Flemish from continuing to enjoy wealth and follow up industry, except in the rivalship of other nations, particularly of Holland and England. For though France was farther advanced as a manufacturing and wealthy nation than England, yet it was not in the same line of industry with the people of the Netherlands, whose prosperity was not therefore injured by it in the same degree. As for the Dutch, they continued to increase in wealth till the end of the 17th century, and their decline requires a more particular attention. In addition to their great industry, the fisheries, and art of curing fish, the Dutch excelled in making machines of various sorts, and became the nation that supplied others with materials, in a state ready prepared for manufacturing. This was a new branch of business, and very lucrative. For, as the machines were kept a secret, the abbreviation of labor was great, and the materials had still the advantage in their sale that a raw material has over manufactured goods, so that the advantages were almost beyond example. Add to all this that the Dutch were the first to establish the banking system, copying in part from the Italians, on a solid plan. The advantages that Holland enjoyed were, indeed, all of its own procuring, but they were numerous and inappreciable, without counting the trade to India, of which it enjoyed a greater share than any other nation for a considerable period. No nation has shown so completely as the Dutch how exterior enemies may be repelled and difficulties overcome, while there is a true attention to the real welfare of the country. The exertions of the Romans to conquer others scarcely surpassed those of the Dutch to preserve themselves when they were in a state of necessity, but when they became affluent, energy and unanimity left them. The manufacturers became merchants, and the merchants became agents and carriers, so that the solid sources of riches gradually disappeared. All this time, taxation increased, and though no nation ever allowed its manners to be less corrupted by the possession of wealth, yet there was a sensible change. But the change in the way of thinking was the most pernicious. Discontent with the government and disagreements amongst themselves completed their misfortunes, while England was all the time endeavoring to supplant them in the most beneficial sources of their wealth. The Dutch fairly sunk by that rivalship and natural change of things, which transfers the seat of wealth and commerce from one nation to another. There was no violent revolution, no invasion by an enemy. It was the silent operation of that cause of decline, which has been already mentioned in the second chapter, and will be farther and more particularly illustrated and explained. The Dutch had a superabundance of capital, the interest of money was low, and wealth had begun to leave Holland long before the symptoms of decay became visible, by which means the trade of other countries was encouraged, and, as always will be the case, capital emigrated the moment it could find secure employment, and greater profits than were to be obtained at home. The leading causes of the decline of Holland may be distinguished thus. The taxes were gradually increasing. Its superiority in manufactures over other countries was continually diminishing. Consequently, industry was not so well rewarded and less active. The merchants preferred safe agencies for foreigners to trading on their own bottom, thereby lending their credit. Dutch capital was employed to purchase goods in one country and sell them in another, so that the Dutch became carriers for others, instead of manufacturing and carrying for themselves. The trade to India and the banking business were both taken up by other nations, so that Holland then lost her superiority in these branches. Thus circumstanced, Holland was gradually sinking when political troubles, the end of which it is not easy to foresee, put her at the feet of France, an event that would not have happened in the manner it did when the true spirit of patriotism reigned, that distinguished her in her more prosperous days. From this, at least, there is one distinct lesson to be learnt, that however it may be natural for nations to lose a superiority owing to arts, inventions, or foreign trade, yet if the minds of the people and their manners remain pure, they will not be degraded by falling a prey to an enemy. When Holland was not rich, it resisted Spain in all her glory, during a very hard, arduous, and continued struggle. But then the people were united as one man. There were no traitors to raise a voice for Spain against their country. When Holland was wealthy, it did not even attempt to resist France when invaded. But then Holland was divided, and there were in every city men who wished more for the plunder than the prosperity of their country. In viewing the fall of those nations that sunk before the discovery of America, the Eastern Empire was the last that attracted attention. It had been reduced by the Turks with a vigor and energy that promised a renovation, which, however, it did not effect. The Turks brought with them the Mahometan religion, which has debased the manners and degraded the minds of every people. Constantinople, by this change, lost the remains of ancient learning and of commerce, which even the weakness of the emperors and the repeated wars had not been able entirely to destroy. The Greeks were reduced to a state of subordination and slavery, but the Turks were not civilized. They adopted what was luxurious and effeminate of Grecian manners, yet still retained their former ignorance and ferocity. Amongst modern nations, the Turkish government is, in form, a monster, and its existence an enigma, yet it extended its sway over all that was most valuable or most splendid in the ancient world. Greece, Egypt, Phoenicia, Syria, the three Arabias, and countries then, but little known, are subject to a brutish people, who do not even condescend to mix with the inhabitants of the country, but who rule over them in a manner the most humiliating and disgraceful. The Turkish government has never been powerful. The city of Venice was always its equal at sea, and as it disdains to adopt the systems of other nations, it is every day becoming weaker in comparison with them. It has formerly maintained successful struggles against Germany, Poland, and Russia, but that time is now over, and it owes its present existence to the jealousy of other powers. It is possessed of a greater quantity of good territory than all the leading nations of Europe, Russia excepted, and it is not the interest of men living in less favored climates to endeavor to renovate the country of Alexander and of the other great nations of antiquity. The Turkish nation is represented as greatly on the decline, but soon after its establishment, It had every vice that could well exist in a government. And its greatest weakness now arises more from the alteration produced in other nations for the better than in itself for the worse. The difficulty of keeping people in ignorance is becoming every day greater, and when the Ottoman throne falls, the usual order of things will be reversed. For, as other governments may attribute their destruction to corruption of manners and to ignorance, the Turkish government looks there for its security. And the day that any reasonable degree of light breaks in amongst its subjects will be its last. To endeavor tracing the causes of decline in a state that owes its existence to its defects, and is in every respect different from other nations, would be useless in the present inquiry. It has only been noticed to show that, in the infinite variety of things, some may owe their existence to what is in general the cause of destruction.
Chapter 8.
From the revolutions that have taken place amongst wealthy and powerful nations to the present time, though the origin has been owing to very different causes, and the decline and removal from one place to another has been attended with circumstances not similar, yet the same leading cause for that decline may not only be traced easily and distinctly, but is so evident that it is impossible for it to be overlooked or mistaken. Local situation, or temporary circumstances, have always afforded the first means of rising to wealth and greatness. The minds of men in a poor state seem never to have neglected an opportunity, presented either by the one or the other, and they have generally proved successful, till energy of mind and industry were banished by the habits of luxury, negligence, and pride, which accompany, or at least soon follow, the acquisition of either. Where wealth has been acquired first, power has generally been sought for afterwards. And where power came first, it has always sought the readiest road to wealth by attacking those who were in possession of it. The nations and cities on the borders of the Mediterranean Sea, where arts and commerce first began, where agriculture flourished, and population had risen to a high pitch, carried on perpetual struggles to supplant each other, and in those struggles the most wealthy generally sunk under, till Alexander, the first great conqueror, with whose history we are tolerably well acquainted, reduced them all to his yoke. One small and brave people triumphing over the Egyptian and Assyrian empires, where wealth and luxury had already produced their effects. Though this triumph of poverty over riches was very complete, except in one single instance, it did not occasion any real change, either in the abodes of wealth or the channels of commerce. Tyre, the richest commercial city till then, was ruined to make way for the prosperity of Alexandria, which became the most wealthy, drawing great part of the commerce from Carthage on the west and taking the whole from Rhinocolura on the east. But in Egypt and Syria, Babylon and Memphis still remained great cities. The whole of this ancient world was for a moment under one chief, but was soon again divided amongst the generals who succeeded to that great conqueror, and the Egyptian and Persian empires became rivals, as Egypt and Syria had been before. The Grecian nations still remained the chief seats of civilization and the fine arts, and this continued till the Romans, originally a poorer people than the Macedonians, conquered the whole. This was the second great triumph of poverty and energy over wealth and grandeur, and in this struggle, Greece itself fell. The effects of wealth were not less formidable to the Romans themselves than they had been to those nations they had enabled that brave and warlike people to conquer, so that the mistress of the world, in her turn, fell before nations that were rude and barbarous, but uncorrupted by wealth and luxury. The conquerors of Rome were too rude, and too many in number, to become themselves enervated by wealth, which disappeared under their rapacious grasp, and which they neither had the art nor inclination to preserve. This invasion of the fertile and rich provinces by men rude and ignorant, but who came from northern climates, established a new order of things, and only a small remnant of former wealth and greatness was preserved in Egypt and at Constantinople. For several centuries of war and confusion, commerce and the arts appear to have been undervalued and neglected, but still the taste for Oriental luxuries was not entirely banished, and at the first interval of peace and safety, sprung up again. It was then that Alexandria, Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople became the channels through which the people of Europe procured the luxuries of Asia. Babylon, Memphis, Palmyra, and all the other great cities of antiquity were no more. Even Greece had lost its arts and splendor. Alexandria and Constantinople were repeatedly assailed, taken, and conquered by the barbarians who envied their wealth, but who still found an interest in continuing them as channels for procuring to European nations the refinements of the East. Though Venice and Genoa were wealthy, they were but small and of little importance, and all the nations who might have crushed them at a blow, only considering them as seaports of convenience and utility, allowed them to remain independent. As an intercourse had been established between the northern and southern parts, a taste for the luxuries of Asia had extended to the shores of the Baltic. Soon after, the victorious arms of Charlemagne had carried there some degree of civilization and the Christian religion. Then it was that a new and more widely extended system of commerce, but something like what had formerly existed in Tyre and Carthage, began in all the maritime towns of Europe, when Italy and Flanders became the most wealthy parts of Europe. A spirit of chivalry and a desire of conquest, not founded on the same principles with the conquests of ancient nations or of Rome to obtain wealth, pervaded all Europe, and the greatest confusion prevailed. In the history of wealth and power, as connected together, this is a chasm. Those who had power despised wealth and were seeking after what they esteemed more military glory, and wealth was confined to a number of insulated spots and possessed by men who were merchants, without any share of power or authority. This extraordinary and unprecedented state of things gave rise to the Hanseatic League, which rose at last to such importance that those who had been so long seeking after glory, without finding it, began to see the importance which was derived from wealth. They began to see that, even in the pursuit of their favorite object, wealth was an excellent assistant, and the friendship of merchants begun to be solicited by princes, as in the days of Tyre and Sidon. This progress was greatly facilitated and accelerated by the Crusades, which at the same time that they beggared half the nobility of Europe, gave them a taste for the refinements of the East, and taught them to set some value on the means by which such refinements could be procured. In this manner were things proceeding, when three great discoveries changed the situation of mankind. The mariner's compass, gunpowder, and the art of printing were all discovered nearly about the same time, and independent of their great and permanent effects, they were wonderfully calculated to alter the situation of nations at that period. The navigation of the ocean, which led to the discovery of a passage to the East Indies and of America, gave a mortal blow to the nations situated on the borders of the Mediterranean Sea, who thus found themselves deprived of the commerce of the East. The discovery of gunpowder, a means so powerful of annoying an enemy, without the aid of human force, which places a giant and a dwarf in some sort upon an equality, was wonderfully adapted for doing away the illusions of knight-errantry that had such a powerful effect in making war be preferred to commerce, while printing facilitated the communication of every species of knowledge. It was then that northern nations began to cultivate arts and sciences, as those of the south under a mild heaven, and on a fertile soil, had done 3,000 years before. But ingenuity and invention took a different direction in the north from what they had done in the southern climates. Instead of sovereigns and slaves, men were more in mutual want of each other, and therefore a more equal division of the fruits of industry was required. The manufactures of former times had been confined chiefly to luxuries for the great, and simple necessaries for slaves. And commerce, though productive of great wealth to a few, was in its limits equally confined. It was natural that the two nations which had first discovered the passage to the east, and the continent of the west, which abounded with the precious metals, should become rich and powerful, as those cities had formerly done that possessed exclusively the channels of commerce. Those two countries were Spain and Portugal, but here again we find the same fatality attend the acquisition of wealth that had formerly been remarked. It was indeed not to be expected that the steadiness and virtue of the Spaniards and Portuguese could resist the operation of a cause that neither the wisdom of the Egyptians, the arts and industry of Greece, nor the stubborn and martial patriotism of the Romans could withstand. Those two nations soon sunk, and the Dutch, the French, and the English became participators of the commerce. Manufactures were a new source of wealth, almost unknown to the ancient world. Those begun first to be set in activity in Flanders, then in Holland and France, and last of all, in England. But like commerce and every other means by which wealth is acquired, they have a tendency to leave a country. The cause and the effect are at variance after a certain time. And though we cannot illustrate this from history, as we may the migrations of wealth arising from other sources, the tendency appears of the same nature, though with this difference, that men may always labor for themselves and enjoy the fruits of their labors, though they cannot always find the means of being the carriers to other nations or becoming merchants. This alteration in the nature of wealth, the inventions of mankind, the alterations brought on by the facility of communicating knowledge, the systematical manner in which men pursue their interests, and other changes, give reason to hope that, in the present situation of things, those possessions may be rendered permanent, that have hitherto been found to be so evanescent and fugitive. Where wealth has not been wrested from a country by absolute force, in doing which the poorer nations were always successful, it has emigrated from other causes and taken up its abode amongst a new people, where circumstances were more favorable for its encouragement. Before we leave this recapitulation, it is necessary, however, to take notice of one revolution that did not take place on similar principles with the others, so far as wealth and luxury are in question, but which has in some respects a similarity, and in others is precisely the reverse. About 2 centuries and a half ago, the Polish nation was one of the most powerful in Europe. Russia could not then, nor for long after, contend with it. The Prussians were its vassals, and the capital of the German Empire, when besieged by the Turks in 1650, owed its safety to the Poles, its brave and faithful allies. Such was the case, but at this day the Polish nation is no longer in existence. It is subdued, parceled out, and divided amongst those very powers, to any of which it was at least equal, and to the others superior at so late a period. It may be asked whether Poland was one of those states that has been borne down by its own wealth and opulence, if its ambition, injustice, or any of the other causes so prominent in the decline of nations operated in the total extinction of it from the rank of independent states. Not one of those causes operated, but still it is not altogether an exception to the general rule. When the feudal system was established all over Europe, nations under its influence were so far on an equality, and as they all emerged from that situation nearly about the same time, Poland excepted, they still preserved their relative situations. The Poles, during this change in other states, comparatively lost power. Amongst the alterations produced was that of placing in the hands of the sovereign all the disposable revenue and force of a country, with which standing armies were maintained. Those irregular militias, till then composed of the barons and their retainers, a species of force, at best, far inferior to regular armies, became useless, but particularly so after the modes of fighting had been changed by the invention of gunpowder and the adoption of large trains of artillery, which could never have been employed in the feudal armies. The disposable force of Poland and its revenues did not, by any means, keep pace with those of neighboring nations, and what was still worse, the strength of that unfortunate country was divided. The monarchy was elective, and foreign influence had a means of exertion, which, under a hereditary line of kings, is not practicable. Poland was not only weaker than its neighbors, but became a prey to intestine divisions, cabal, and intrigue. Though Poland was not wealthy, according to the meaning applied to that word, it was a populous and fertile country, and therefore a desirable possession to the neighboring states. To Prussia, a most ambitious and aggrandizing power with a military government and of a very limited extent, it was peculiarly desirable. To Russia, extensive as it is, the fruitful territory was also an object of ambition, from its proximity to the seat of an empire, the most fertile and fine provinces of which lie at a distance. The same desire of possessing what they wanted, operating at the same time on 2 neighboring nations, occasioned them to unite their power in a first dismemberment of Poland for their mutual benefit. The interior convulsions of the country served as a pretext, and its weakness furnished the means of executing the design. In 1772, that independent country first lost some of its finest provinces, but this was only a prelude to its final fall. The nature of ambition is to augment with success, and as the same divisions continued in the state, a pretense for a farther interference in its affairs was easily found. And in 1794, Poland ceased to be one of the number of European states. In this last seizure, the House of Austria had no immediate hand. It was, however, necessary to have its consent, and as the aggrandizement of Prussia was not an object of indifference to Austria, participation in the spoils was proposed as the price of acquiescence, and it was readily accepted. In this case, the weakness of Poland and the ambition of its rivals and neighbors were the immediate causes of its destruction. But that weakness arose from a want of true patriotism and proper attention in the people themselves. Jealous of liberties and disobedient to their king, the Poles were slaves to the feudal proprietors of the soil. Though the first cause was different, yet their divisions and quarrels were the same in effect, as if they had proceeded from real causes of discontent and a deranged state of society, such as we have seen, when the love of the country is lost. In Poland, that love of the country was not lost, but it was badly directed, which is nearly the same thing. At least, it is equally dangerous. Why, it may be asked, did not the other powers of Europe interfere? To this, indeed, it would be difficult to give a satisfactory answer. Those who did not interfere, probably, may have cause to repent their indifference. It was an infraction of that sort of federation of nations which had been found necessary to prevent a repetition of conquests like those of Alexander or of the Romans. Yet, still there is a way of accounting for their conduct, though it cannot be vindicated. In the first place, Poland lays remote from those powerful nations that have had the greatest sway in modern times. It was not very easy to interfere with great efficacy. Besides, as Poland was previously under foreign influence, the essential evil was done. The example of partitions, indeed, was not given, but it is not impossible that some powers on the continent, though they got no share, might not be sorry to see such an example. Britain and Spain certainly could not wish for the example, but others might, and others probably did wish for it. The first division was, besides, only a beginning. Some degree of moderation was preserved, and Poland was only mutilated. It was not destroyed. The case was not entirely new, nor without example. The second and last division took place at a time when the nations whose interest it was, and whose wish it might have been to interfere, had not the means of doing so. It was when the Republican frenzy in France was at its most desperate height, and whom the whole of civilized Europe appeared to be in danger. There is one more excuse to be found. The aspect of affairs in Poland resembled, with regard to its revolutions, those of France so much, that those who at another time would have probably interfered were rather inclined to cooperate in stifling a rising flame in the north, similar to that which had endangered the whole of the south of Europe. In all this, the thing the most difficult to be accounted for is the conduct of the Polish nation. But an inquiry into the causes of that would be quite foreign to the present subject. This is, however, an instance of the danger arising from not keeping pace with other nations in those arts of government and internal policy which constitute the power of nations in the general order of things, whatever that may be. Although we have seldom found intestine divisions carried to so blamable a length in any other nation that was not corrupt in itself, yet it is clear that the influence obtained by the wealth of its neighbors was at the bottom of those highly blamable and dreadfully fatal divisions. When aggrandizement is the aim of modern states, there will not now be any difficulty of pleading example, and there is one of those very powers that on this occasion participated in the division which has all the seeds of discord in itself that brought on the ruin of the Polish Empire. That power has already felt the effect of example, and though it may repine, it cannot complain as it might otherwise have done, or if it does, it cannot expect equal commiseration.
This concludes today's reading of an inquiry into the permanent causes of the decline and fall of powerful and wealthy nations, by William Playfair. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.